He thought he was just cleaning out his father's old summer garage after the funeral, trying to put away a life everyone else in the family had already dismissed. But when the cracked floor suddenly gave way beneath his feet, veteran Thomas Reed realized his father had been guarding something far bigger than dusty tools or forgotten memories. Ranger, his loyal German shepherd, sensed it first, scratching insistently at the broken concrete until a hidden steel trapdoor slowly revealed itself beneath the dust. When Thomas lifted the hatch and aimed his flashlight into the darkness below, he froze, because what lay beneath wasn't junk at all. It was an entire underground vault filled with pristine classic cars worth millions, untouched for 35 years. And the message Henry Reed left behind was about to change Thomas's life forever. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The summer heat hung heavily over Bend, Oregon, pressing down on the small cemetery like a silent weight. Thomas Reed, a 55-year-old veteran with a rugged face and a salt-and-pepper beard, stood alone beside his father's casket. Sweat darkened the collar of his old brown leather jacket, but he didn't remove it. Ranger, his German shepherd, with a black saddleback and copper-brown chest, stayed close at his side, sensing more than simple grief. No other family had come. The pastor's soft words drifted away on the hot wind, leaving a quiet almost too sharp to bear. Thomas stared at the coffin, as if searching for something he could no longer ask. He placed an old brass lighter on top, the one that had traveled between father and son across decades. Ranger nudged his leg, letting out a low whine that echoed Thomas's own ache. Henry Reed had been a difficult man, but he hadn't deserved an empty farewell. The world never understood him, not the neighbors, not the family, not even Thomas until these final days. And now the questions Henry carried had been buried with him. Thomas turned away from the grave when the pastor left, his boots crunching across dry grass. The July sun shimmered on the road ahead as he drove back to the old house at the edge of town. Ben's summer afternoons always carried a strange stillness, the kind that made memories feel louder than they should. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears flicking at every shift in Thomas's breathing. The house hadn't changed. Paint peeled along the siding, the windows fogged from years of Oregon heat and winter storms. Inside, everything smelled faintly of oil and dust, the scent of Henry's workshop lingering like a shadow. Thomas walked through the living room slowly, touching old furniture as if it might reveal the thoughts his father never spoke. But it was the backyard that pulled at him. Ranger padded ahead, nose lifted, tail stiff with curiosity. The summer garage stood crooked behind the house, its roof sagging, its wooden panels warped by time. Thomas felt something strange settle in his chest, a mix of dread and recognition, as if the building were staring back at him. He stepped off the porch, the ground hot beneath his boots. Ranger stayed close, muscles tense, eyes locked on the garage. The dog rarely reacted this way unless something was off, an instinct Thomas had learned to trust during long nights on deployment. Today, Ranger felt that same tension, that same alertness. Thomas approached the garage door and slowed when he noticed a thin line of light striking through a crack in the panels. It wasn't the warm color of sunlight. It was sharper, metallic, out of place in a structure that should have been full of shadows. His fingers tightened around the handle as Ranger pressed forward, ears high. The door groaned when he pulled. Dust drifted through the shaft of light, and just beyond the threshold, something gleamed, an outline, a shape, a reflection that froze Thomas completely. He didn't understand what he was looking at yet, but he knew, with a certainty that clenched deep in his chest, that Henry Reed had not left this world empty-handed. And whatever waited inside the garage was the beginning of a truth Thomas was never supposed to find. The heat inside Henry Reed's old wooden house clung to the walls like a restless presence, thick and unmoving, as Thomas stepped through the doorway with Ranger trotting close behind him. The air smelled of sawdust, metal filings, and long summers where windows were left open, but breath still felt heavy. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow, his gaze drifting across the room, as if the house were watching him back. Something in him tightened, an instinct born from years of reading danger before it had a face. He moved toward the small desk his father always kept beside the living room window. The surface was cluttered with bolts, an old wrench, faded receipts, and a half-disassembled engine gauge that Henry had sworn he would finish someday. But it was the tin box, small, scratched, and pushed far into the corner, that caught Thomas's eye. He reached for it, feeling its unexpected weight settle into his palm. Ranger let out a soft grunt, sitting beside him with his head tilted, eyes alert with a knowingness only a dog like him could carry. Inside the tin box was a key, unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. The bow was shaped like a small steering wheel, carved with ridges worn smooth by years of handling. The shaft was thick, solid, older than anything used in modern locks. Beneath it lay a folded sheet of yellowed paper. Thomas unfolded it slowly and found a hand-drawn map, his father's unmistakable blocky handwriting marking coordinates across the property. And at the bottom, written in the shaky script of Henry's final months, were 5 words that sent a ripple through Thomas's chest. "It's time the truth returns." His breath lodged in his throat for a moment, memories of Henry's half-formed sentences surfacing in flashes, nights before his death, when he seemed to drift between the present and something heavier, something he never spoke aloud. Thomas folded the map carefully, as though afraid the ink might vanish if handled too hard. Ranger nudged his leg, emitting a low, purposeful growl, not of fear, but of urging. The dog stepped toward the back door, glancing back as if to say, "You're looking in the wrong place. Follow me." Outside, the July sun beat down on the yard with an almost unforgiving glare. Ranger's paws pressed into the dry earth as he made a direct line toward the old garage. The structure looked even more fragile in daylight, its panels warped, its paint long surrendered to time. But Ranger's posture stiffened, with an intent that made Thomas's pulse thrum. The dog stood at the door, nose brushing the bottom seam, tail rigid, as if something behind the wood breathed. Thomas approached slowly, the key and map still in hand. He pushed the door open further than he had before, and the warm air inside hit him with a mixture of stale oil, dust, and something metallic that didn't feel normal. As the light filtered through the crack, the first object revealed itself. A 1969 Ford Mustang, its iconic lines dulled by layers of dust but unmistakable beneath the neglect. The car's faded cherry-red paint still glinted faintly in the sunlight, as though eager to be seen after years of darkness. Thomas stepped closer, running a finger along the hood. The dust parted under his touch, revealing the smoothness beneath. Ranger circled the car, sniffing hard at the air, his ears flicking with restless energy. Then, without warning, the dog stopped sharply and turned toward the far corner of the garage. There, running across the concrete floor like a scar, was a long, jagged crack. It stretched from one wall to the other, wide enough in places for shadows to swallow the light. Thomas crouched, lowering his head until he was nearly nose level with it. The air rising from the crack was cooler than the surrounding heat. Too cool, as if something beneath the floor held its own separate temperature. Ranger pressed his paw into the crack, letting out another low growl, this one deeper, vibrating with a tension that made the hairs on Thomas's arms lift. He leaned closer, shining his phone's flashlight into the fissure. Something metallic flashed back at him, but it wasn't the shimmer of a pipe or rebar. It was curved, polished, deliberate. Thomas frowned. "Dad, what were you doing down here?" He stepped back and scanned the garage again. Dust-covered shelves, old tool chests, a hanging lamp with its shade half crushed, and against the far wall, half hidden behind boxes, a small metal cabinet that Thomas didn't remember from childhood. It was waist-high, painted forest green, dented along one side as if something heavy had slammed into it years ago. He approached it, brushing away cobwebs. The cabinet had a keyhole, and the shape carved into the metal around it was unmistakable. A small steering wheel, identical to the key he'd found. His heart thudded once, hard and certain. He slid the old key in. It fit perfectly. The lock clicked with a tone so sharp and final that Ranger lifted his head in alarm. Thomas opened the cabinet door slowly. Inside lay rows of documents sealed in plastic sleeves, neatly arranged despite years of isolation. Military markings, vehicle inventories, lists of serial numbers for cars older than the Mustang behind him. Some pages bore the stamp of the U.S. Department of Transportation from the 1970s. Others bore no official markings at all, just handwritten notes in his father's unmistakable scrawl. One file in particular stood out, labeled only with the number 47 Alpha. Thomas lifted it carefully, feeling a strange tension coil in his chest. Ranger sat beside him, tail completely still, watching with an intelligence that made Thomas whisper aloud. This wasn't just a garage, was it? He opened the file. Inside were faded photographs of old classic cars, rare models, some worth fortunes even in their time, lined up inside what looked like a massive underground facility. Not a garage, not a warehouse. Something deeper, something meant to be hidden. Under each photograph, Henry Reed had written notes in precise block letters. Acquired 1969. Sealed 1971. Do not move. Keep them safe. Thomas felt the floor tilt under him for a moment. His father, quiet, stubborn, misunderstood Henry Reed, had been guarding something far more extraordinary than anyone in the family had ever guessed. Something he had protected for 35 years without telling a soul. And as Ranger nudged his knee again, eyes fixed on the crack in the concrete, Thomas realized the Mustang wasn't the heart of the secret. It was only the beginning. There was something beneath the garage floor, something Henry had sealed away with his last breath. And whatever it was, Ranger had already sensed it. Thomas stood slowly, heart pounding, as he stared at the jagged crack stretching like an invitation across the garage. The heat outside pressed in, but the air rising from the gap felt cold enough to raise goosebumps. Ranger's ears lifted. He took a single step toward the fissure. Thomas followed, and as he reached out to touch the crack again, the floor beneath his boots gave a faint tremble, just enough to tell him that the truth his father promised had only begun to wake. The afternoon heat in Bend settled thickly around the garage, as Thomas knelt beside the long crack cutting across the concrete floor. Sweat gathered at his temples, but he barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the thin metallic glint he had seen earlier. Ranger stood close, tail stiff, nose pressed almost to the ground as he sniffed the fault line with growing intensity. Something beneath the surface was stirring instincts the dog had learned to trust long before civilian life. Thomas slid a flat pry bar into the narrow gap, the metal scraping sharply against concrete. The sound echoed through the still air, bouncing off the wooden walls of the old summer garage. The floor shifted under the pressure, dust rising in pale clouds that shimmered in the sunbeams cutting through the windows. Ranger backed up a step, growling low, the fur along his spine lifting ever so slightly. When the crack widened, a new texture appeared, smooth, cold, reflective. Thomas froze, leaning closer as his fingers brushed the edge of a steel surface hidden beneath decades of dust and cement. His pulse quickened as he cleared more debris away, revealing the outline of a large square panel, a steel hatch, something no one had mentioned, and something that his father had never intended the family to discover. With a hard tug, the metal hatch groaned open, releasing a breath of cold air that carried an unexpected smell of oil, metal polish, and age. Ranger barked once sharply, then stepped forward to stand at the edge, peering into the darkness below. Thomas pointed his flashlight down the steep metal ladder, illuminating walls lined with riveted steel plates, descending into a hollow blackness. He hesitated for a moment, memories of previous deployments flashing uninvited through his mind. Tight spaces, unknown threats, and the sharp survival instincts that had kept him alive. But something deeper than fear pushed him forward. The unfinished words his father never got to say. His jaw tightened with quiet resolve as he gripped the ladder and began his descent. Ranger followed immediately, slipping down each rung with practiced ease, a trained confidence from years of search and rescue drills Thomas had put him through. When his boots hit solid ground, the beam of his flashlight swept across the chamber and the breath left his lungs. The underground vault stretched wide beneath the garage, built from reinforced concrete walls and steel girders, its floor coated in a thin sheen of oil and time. But what stole his breath was not the vault itself. It was the row of immaculate silhouettes waiting in the dark. As his flashlight traveled, chrome gleamed in long, untouched lines. A Cadillac Eldorado 1957 stood first, its fins sweeping like the wings of a silent predator. Dust coated its body, but the contours remained majestic, preserved by the stillness of decades. Ranger circled it once, his nails clicking softly against the concrete, as if he too sensed the importance of what they'd found. Beside it rested a Chevrolet Bel Air 1955, the iconic turquoise paint now muted beneath dust, but still shining faintly under the flashlight beam. Thomas stepped closer, his hand hovering above the hood before gently brushing away a thin layer of grime. The car felt like a memory trapped in steel, waiting for someone to remember it. Further down the line, a Pontiac GTO 1965 sat muscular and low, the shape of its body shouting power even in silence. Next to it was the unexpected presence of a Buick Century 1941 in military green, its faded insignia hinting at wartime transport. And at the far end, completing the impossible gallery, stood a Ford Model A 1931, its upright frame like a relic carved out of history. Thomas could barely speak, but his mind raced. These were not just rare cars, they were legends, vehicles worth fortunes in collectors' markets. each one representing decades of American craftsmanship and automotive evolution, and all of them sat untouched beneath a simple wooden garage that everyone thought was worthless. Ranger let out a short bark, drawing Thomas toward a metal cabinet near the rear of the vault. The cabinet was heavy, painted gray, with a thick rotary lock built onto its face. The kind the military used, the kind that didn't open without deliberate intention. Thomas knelt forward, gripping the rotary dial with steady fingers. He turned it slowly, listening for faint clicks, relying on instincts sharpened in weapon storage rooms halfway across the world. A soft click rang out, followed by another, and the safe door swung open with a hiss of stale, cold air. Inside rested several folders marked with a faded red stripe, each stamped with block letters, FBI, confidential. Thomas swallowed hard and pulled the first file free, the paper thick and yellowed at the edges. When he flipped it open, he saw his father's name printed on half the pages. The documents told a story he never imagined Henry Reed carrying alone. In the early 1980s, an underground network trafficking stolen classic cars across state lines had risen in the West. The FBI had struggled to penetrate it until Henry, then a quiet mechanic with sharp instincts, accidentally uncovered the ring through a customer whose Mustang carried mismatched VIN plates. Instead of turning away, Henry joined the investigation as a covert informant, feeding intelligence that eventually helped dismantle one of the largest vehicle smuggling operations in the country. But the files also revealed the darker side. The ringleaders learned someone close to them was cooperating with federal agents. Threats escalated. A warning shot fired into his garage, a break-in attempt, and a chilling note. "We know you have a son." Thomas sat still, absorbing each detail, the weight of it pressing against his chest. Henry had withdrawn from public life not out of stubbornness or bitterness, but out of fear. Fear that retaliation would reach his only child. The quiet, summers, the distance from extended family, the remote lifestyle, it had all been protection. Ranger pressed his head gently against Thomas's knee, sensing the shift in his breathing. Thomas rested a hand on the dog's shoulders, steadying himself as he read the final pages. The vault had been constructed as part of Henry's witness protection arrangement, built to store recovered vehicles until they could be returned or used as evidence. But when the case collapsed due to corruption in the chain of command, the vault was sealed and forgotten, or rather, forgotten by everyone but Henry. A final note lay at the bottom of the safe, a handwritten message in Henry's familiar blocky script. Thomas lifted it carefully, the paper trembling slightly in his fingers. It read only, "I hid the truth to keep you alive. Now it's yours to finish." As Thomas lowered the note, a cold ripple ran through him. Not fear, but realization. His father had left him more than a vault of cars or files. He had left him a responsibility, something unfinished, something waiting to rise from beneath the dust of old engines and sealed concrete. And behind Thomas, deeper in the vault's shadows, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears shot forward, his body stiffened with a low, rumbling growl. Something, or someone, was there, or had been. The echo that followed was faint, metallic, and terribly out of place. The heat lingered into late afternoon as Thomas Reed wiped a streak of dust from his arm, the air inside the old garage still buzzing with the shock of what he had discovered. Ranger paced near the cracked floor, the thick black and copper fur along his spine rising each time a distant sound broke the stillness. Thomas could feel the same unease vibrating through him, a tension that had nothing to do with the hidden vault of classic cars beneath his feet. It was the sense that opening the past had consequences he could no longer ignore. He had barely stepped back into the kitchen when tires crackled over the gravel driveway, the noise too sharp, too intentional to belong to a passerby. Ranger stiffened and trotted to the window, barking once, a warning, not a greeting. Thomas peeked through the curtain as an SUV pulled beside the porch, and 3 silhouettes climbed out with the confidence of people who believed everything in sight already belonged to them. His chest tightened in a way far different from grief. The first to reach the steps was Jacob Reed, Thomas's younger brother by 8 years, a man in his late 40s with a thick neck, rounded shoulders, and a permanent scowl carved into his face. Jacob's once dark hair had thinned into a patchy comb-over, and his eyes carried the sharpness of someone who always blamed the world for what he lacked. He had never served a day in uniform like Thomas, never left Bend, and never forgiven their father for refusing to fund his business failures. Jacob approached with a swagger that barely concealed his bitterness. Behind him trailed his two teenage sons, Mark, a tall, lanky 16-year-old with messy blonde hair and restless hands, and Tyler, 14, shorter, stockier, with a bored expression that masked a talent for finding trouble. They moved with the careless entitlement of boys raised by a father who believed everything old could be sold, scrapped, or traded. While Mark scanned the yard with a calculating gaze, Tyler kicked at the porch rail as if testing what might break first. Thomas stepped outside, his posture calm but unwelcoming. He kept one hand lightly on Ranger's shoulder, feeling the dog's loaded growl rumble through his palm. Jacob ignored the tension and climbed the steps as though entering his own home, wiping sweat from his forehead with a smirk. "Heard you're clearing out the place," he said, his voice thick and dismissive. "Figured we'd help before you throw all the good stuff away." Ranger let out another growl, deeper this time, and Jacob stumbled back a step, surprised but not humbled. Thomas met his gaze, his own eyes steady, carrying years of discipline that Jacob never understood. "There isn't anything here for you," Thomas said quietly. "I'm handling everything." Jacob scoffed loudly, waving a careless hand toward the garage. "That junk heap out back? Dad kept it full of worthless metal for decades. We'll call a buyer, split whatever we get, and move on." Mark and Tyler exchanged eager glances at the mention of money, their eyes lighting with greedy curiosity. Thomas felt the air shift. They had come for profit, not respect, and certainly not memory. Jacob brushed past him without waiting for permission and strode toward the yard, his boots crunching in the brittle grass. The boys followed, shoving each other, feigning tough bravado. Ranger lunged forward instinctively, but Thomas held him back with a soft command. They reached the garage door and tried to push in, but the moment the hinges creaked, Ranger charged, teeth bared, body rigid. He planted himself between the entrance and Jacob's advancing foot. The brothers froze, startled by the ferocity of a dog who rarely showed aggression. Ranger's bark thundered through the yard, a sound layered with warning and ownership. Jacob stepped back quickly, raising both hands. "What's wrong with your mutt? It's just a dusty garage." Thomas reached them slowly, his face controlled but cold. "He protects what matters," Thomas said, "and nothing in there concerns you." Jacob opened his mouth to argue, but something in Thomas's tone silenced him. Thomas ushered them back toward the house, ignoring their complaints about heat, dogs, and inheritance. He offered them water to diffuse the tension, though his jaw remained tight. Ranger stayed in the hallway, eyes locked on the back door as if expecting an ambush. Jacob sprawled into a kitchen chair, wiping sweat from his face with exaggerated discomfort. The boys raided the fridge as if entitlement were their birthright. Jacob crossed his arms, his expression turning pointed. "Look, Tom, Dad didn't leave you everything. Don't make this hard. We know there's stuff in that garage worth selling. And we're not walking away empty-handed." Thomas kept his voice low but firm. "There's nothing for sale." Jacob leaned forward, face reddening with frustration. "Then why's that dog acting like he guards Fort Knox?" Thomas didn't answer, and Jacob mistook the silence as weakness. He grabbed his keys, muttering something about lawyers and stolen property, and barged out, dragging his sons along. Their SUV sped off in a cloud of dust, leaving the silence of the yard heavier than before. Ranger finally relaxed, but only slightly, as if threats could return at any moment. That evening, as twilight settled over Bend, Thomas retreated to his father's old study with the FBI files spread across the table. The pages were yellowed, stamped with the red blocks of confidential and restricted, and carried the faint chemical smell of government archives. He read each document twice, sometimes 3 times, piecing together a past Henry had sacrificed everything to bury. There had been a smuggling ring in the early 1980s, a violent group trafficking rare classic cars across state lines, using forged titles and hidden warehouses. Henry had been a mechanic with a quiet eye for details, and he became an unexpected asset in an undercover operation led by federal agents. One man in particular, Agent William Carter, appeared repeatedly in the reports. He had been a tall, narrow-faced investigator with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for relentless pursuit. Henry had become his key informant, the one who noticed what others missed. The operation had ended badly. Several leaders of the smuggling ring were arrested, but others fled, vowing revenge on anyone tied to the case. Henry had been moved off the record, his identity scrubbed, his garage sealed with the vehicles he protected as evidence. And all of it, every threat, every shadow, was meant to shield one person, his son. Thomas leaned back, heart pounding, the weight of the revelation carving through him. Ranger sat at his feet, head resting on Thomas's boot, eyes watching every flicker in his expression. Thomas let out a slow breath as the truth settled into his bones. Opening the vault hadn't just uncovered old metal. It had stirred the dust of men who had sworn vengeance decades ago. Somewhere out there, pieces of the smuggling ring were still alive, still looking, still waiting. And if they caught wind of the vault, or Henry's final message, they would come. A knock sounded at the front door. Thomas froze. Ranger's ears shot up, and in the quiet electricity of that moment, Thomas understood the past was not done with him, not by a long shot. The heat of the Bend, Oregon night wrapped itself around the old house like a tight, breathless curtain, the kind that carried the dry scent of sun-baked soil even after midnight. Thomas Reed stood by the kitchen window, the dim bulb above him flickering faintly, his jaw clenched tight as he reread the final page of the FBI file. Every few seconds he glanced toward the backyard, where the summer garage waited in shadow, the secret hatch beneath it still hanging open in his mind. Ranger lay at his feet, head raised, ears twitching with every sound beyond the walls. Thomas felt the same tightening in his gut he used to feel before night patrols, that silent pressure that warned him danger was already moving. The deeper he read into Henry's notes, the more he understood how much his father had sacrificed and how much his silence had protected him. Henry Reed had not simply hid a cache of cars. He had hidden the last evidence that put an entire smuggling network behind bars. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, eyes locked on the back door, as a low rumble vibrated in his chest. Thomas froze, the hair on his arms rising as he heard metal scrape against metal in the darkness outside. Someone was at the garage door. He moved quietly across the room, his movements controlled and steady, the way they had been drilled into him years ago. Ranger rose to full height beside him, muscles taut, tail rigid, his deep growl growing sharper by the second. Through the thin curtains, Thomas saw the silhouette of a man outside the garage, tall, broad-shouldered, deliberate in his movements. This wasn't a curious neighbor. This was someone who knew what they were looking for. The figure tugged again at the garage lock, working with fast, practiced hands that told Thomas this man had broken into places far harder than an old wooden shed. Ranger pressed forward, claws scratching softly against the door. Thomas recognized the shape of danger instantly, the same instinct that kept him alive in combat zones. He motioned Ranger back and reached for the keys to the Mustang 1969 sitting in the garage above the underground vault. There was no time to confront, no time to secure the hatch. Whoever the intruder was, they had come prepared, and Thomas was outnumbered by the dark. Ranger followed him silently, moving as if he too understood the plan without a single word spoken. He slipped out the side door into the blistering heat of the night, the air thick, as if it had been held over flames all day. The Mustang waited, its dusty red paint catching a glint of moonlight. Thomas had restored her piece by piece earlier that week, her engine rumbling back to life after decades of silence. Tonight, she would be their only escape. Ranger leapt into the passenger seat with a single fluid motion, his paws planting firmly against the dashboard. As Thomas turned the ignition, the Mustang fired to life with a deep growl that split the stillness. The intruder spun toward the sound, his face, briefly illuminated by the yellow porch light. He was a middle-aged man with sharp cheeks, dark hair cropped close, and eyes that carried the cold focus of someone who had lived most of his life outside the law. A thin, jagged scar ran from the corner of his jaw to his neck, hinting at violence and survival. The man reached toward his belt for something metallic, but Thomas didn't wait to see what it was. He slammed his foot onto the accelerator, gravel spraying behind him in a burst of dust and sparks. The Mustang shot down the driveway, Ranger bracing himself with a deep bark as the car roared toward the empty road. In the rearview mirror, Thomas saw the intruder jump into a black SUV parked beneath the pines. Headlights flared. The chase began. The night wrapped around the Mustang like a cloak as Thomas pushed the engine harder than he should have, the heat rising through the floorboards. Ranger kept his gaze fixed on the rear window, growling low every time the SUV gained a few feet. Thomas gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale, his mind racing as fast as the engine. The roads around Bend were familiar, but darkness and desperation turned every bend into a battlefield. He took a hard left down a narrow service road lined with dry grass and telephone poles, hoping to shake the pursuer in tighter terrain. The Mustang's tires screeched, nearly losing grip, but Thomas steadied her with the precision of a man who had driven heavy equipment under fire. The SUV followed without hesitation. Whoever they were, they knew Henry's past, and they knew Thomas now held the final missing piece of the story. Ranger barked sharply as the SUV drew closer, headlights flaring across the Mustang's interior. Thomas's pulse hammered as he pushed the engine to its limits, the speedometer needle climbing steadily. He spotted a small dirt trail branching off into a cluster of pines, barely wide enough for one vehicle. It was a risk, but staying on the open road meant death or capture. He swerved into the trail, the Mustang bouncing violently over uneven ground. Branches slapped the windshield, dust billowed around them, and Ranger steadied himself with tense, focused posture. For a moment, the SUV disappeared from sight. Thomas exhaled, but only once. He knew men like the one behind him. They didn't give up, not when this much money and revenge were at stake. Henry's notes described at least 4 survivors from the 1980s ring, men who had built their lives on crime and had nothing left to lose. A sharp crack split the night. A bullet tore through the branches above them. Thomas ducked instinctively as Ranger barked with explosive fury. The SUV's headlights appeared again, weaving through the trees, closing in tight. Thomas pushed the Mustang harder, the engine howling as though begging for mercy. He kept one hand on the wheel while his other reached slowly toward the glove box where Henry used to keep an old flare gun. But before he could reach it, the trail ended abruptly at the edge of a steep embankment leading down to the river. The moonlight shimmered across the water below, the current fast and dangerous from recent dam release. Thomas slammed the brakes, the Mustang spinning sideways in a shower of dust. Ranger braced himself with a sharp growl. The SUV skidded to a halt several yards behind them, its headlights burning into Thomas's back. The scar-faced man stepped out, his silhouette framed by glaring light. Thomas stared at him through the windshield, heart pounding, Ranger's growl deepening with every breath. The man lifted a hand, signaling to someone unseen in the SUV's passenger side. Another figure stepped out, shorter, heavy-set, wearing a dark cap pulled low, 2 against 1. Thomas tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Ranger's hackles rose. The air felt electric. Somewhere in the stillness, the river's rush echoed like a warning. The man took one step forward, then another, his voice low and cold as he called out, "It's time to finish what your father started." But Thomas wasn't ready to surrender, not with Ranger at his side, not with truths half revealed and dangers closing in. The night held its breath as he prepared to make his move, and the river waited below, ready to swallow whatever came next. The abandoned fire station lay hidden beneath towering pines on the outskirts of Tumalo, its brick walls cracked from decades of heat and winter storms. Thomas Reed stepped inside with Ranger close against his leg, the dog's copper-brown chest rising and falling with alert breaths. The air smelled of soot, old metal, and the faint sweetness of dried pine sap drifting in through broken windows. Thomas set down the heavy box of FBI documents on a rusted steel table and let the silence settle around him like a cloak he had worn too many times before. He unlatched the box carefully, feeling each click of the hinges echo through memories he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The files inside were aged, their corners yellowed, edges curled, and the folders marked with codes that only an agent would understand. Ranger sat directly in front of him, ears forward, tail low, as if bracing for truths he could sense long before Thomas opened a single page. Heat pressed through the broken windows, carrying the faint scent of dry summer grass from outside. The first file contained Henry Reed's photograph from the early 1980s, showing him 20 years younger, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with eyes that carried the same fierce steadiness Thomas had inherited. But beneath the photograph was something Thomas had never known existed: Henry's identification as an FBI confidential informant. The revelation sharpened Thomas's breath, his fingers tightening around the paper, as Ranger let out a soft, sympathetic huff. This was the secret his father had carried alone for 35 years. As Thomas read further, a clearer picture of Henry's past emerged, written in precise, clinical language that made the truth even heavier. His father had spent years feeding information to an FBI task force about a criminal organization laundering millions through stolen vintage automobiles. The group's leaders were ruthless men, names Thomas traced slowly with his thumb. Their files described acts of violence, bribed officials, and the disappearance of multiple witnesses who had dared to speak. Henry had been the only informant whose identity had never been exposed. One folder detailed the 4 leaders of the ring. The first 2 were already marked deceased, noted in brief lines that offered no sympathy. but the other two had vanished into the criminal underworld after the case collapsed, resurfacing occasionally in the background of unrelated investigations. Thomas felt a flash of cold run through him as he connected that truth with the shadowy figure outside the garage 2 nights earlier. Ranger pressed close against his leg, sensing the shift in his master's heartbeat. Inside another document lay a letter written by Henry, dated just 6 months before his death. The handwriting was strong yet shaky, as if he had written it in a quiet moment between waves of pain. "If anything happens to me, the truth must go to the Bureau. I lived in hiding, so you never would." Thomas ran a hand across his face, his jaw trembling despite the heat that surrounded him. Ranger nudged his arm gently, grounding him the way only the dog could. By afternoon, Thomas decided there was only one path forward. He packed the files carefully, ensuring every bit of evidence remained intact. Ranger watched with sharp, focused eyes, his loyalty unwavering. The Mustang, 1969 they had escaped in earlier sat waiting outside the fire station, its dusty red paint gleaming faintly under the sun. Thomas opened the passenger door, and Ranger leaped in with the ease of a dog who knew every shift in his master's life mattered. The drive to Portland took hours beneath the scorching late summer sun, the road unwinding through pine forests and over dry hills. Thomas's thoughts churned like the rumbling engine, heavy with regret, pride, and the weight of a son finally seeing his father clearly. Ranger kept glancing between the window and Thomas's face, reading him the way dogs read storms before humans even smell the rain. For the first time in decades, Thomas whispered aloud, "I should have listened more, Dad." Ranger leaned his head against Thomas's arm silently. When Thomas arrived at the FBI Portland field office, he met Special Agent Rebecca Hale, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp, angular features softened only by exhaustion in her hazel eyes. She wore a dark blazer, her posture straight and practiced, but her voice carried a calm steadiness shaped by years of handling unpredictable truths. She listened intently as Thomas explained everything: his father's death, the hidden vault, the pursuit in the night, her expression tightening with each detail. Next entered Special Agent Marcus Boyd, a tall, thick-jawed man in his early 50s with coarse stubble and the weary look of someone who had seen too much violence to ever sleep peacefully again. His deep voice carried a quiet authority, and he greeted Ranger with a respectful nod before focusing sharply on Thomas. Both agents studied the files Henry left behind, exchanging looks filled with dawning recognition and disbelief. "Your father protected more lives than you'll ever know," Hale finally said, her voice lowering. "We thought he disappeared. We never imagined he was hiding for your sake." The Bureau launched an immediate operation to track the 2 surviving leaders of the smuggling ring. Within days, one was arrested at a cabin near Coeur d'Alene Lake in Idaho, a graying man in his 60s with cold eyes and a limp that suggested a lifetime of violence. The second was captured in Sacramento, attempting to flee to Mexico. He was thin, gaunt, with a crooked nose and a bitterness etched deep into his features. As news reached Thomas, he felt a weight lift, not just for himself, but for the burden his father had carried. After the arrests, Agent Hale personally handed Thomas a sealed document, recognizing Henry Reed's service as a confidential informant whose contributions were critical in dismantling one of the largest automotive laundering rings in the region. The file concluded, "His sacrifice is acknowledged, his honor restored." Thomas held the document tightly, feeling a deep, quiet pride settle into the cracks grief had left behind. The Bureau returned full ownership of the vehicles to Thomas, citing Henry's legal rights to them under sealed agreements from decades before. Thomas stared at the paperwork in awe. The cars were his, not as trophies of a crime ring, but as remnants of his father's courage. Ranger wagged his tail as if sensing victory, but Thomas didn't return home to sell them. Instead, he began sketching a plan shaped from Henry's memory. Over the next weeks, Thomas and Ranger drove the Mustang across Oregon's summer towns, towing one restored classic car at a time, on a small trailer behind them. In Bend, Redmond, Sisters, and Prineville, they opened the doors, invited veterans, families, and curious travelers to step close, to hear the story not of stolen cars, but of a man who protected his son by sacrificing his own peace. Thomas named it the Reed Traveling Museum, a tribute carried not in marble halls, but across open roads Henry loved. People gathered wherever they stopped, older men with caps from past wars, children with wide-eyed wonder, and women touched by the story of a father's silent devotion. Ranger quickly became the museum's guardian and gentle ambassador, greeting visitors with warm eyes and a steady presence. Thomas watched strangers learn about Henry Reed, watched sympathy replace misunderstanding, and felt something in him mend. One evening, as summer neared its end, Thomas parked the Mustang on a hill overlooking Tumalo. The horizon burned orange and gold beneath the settling sun, reflecting in the chrome of the restored Cadillac Eldorado they had brought along. Ranger climbed beside him, placing a paw gently on Thomas's forearm. The warmth of fur, the quiet breeze, and the soft hum of cicadas made the world feel whole again. Thomas whispered into the fading light, "You're not alone anymore, Dad." Ranger leaned his head into Thomas's shoulder, a silent vow to defend the legacy they now carried together. The sun dipped behind the hills, but the story of Henry Reed would travel far beyond this moment, kept alive by a son, a dog, and the road stretching endlessly ahead. In the end, Thomas understood something far greater than the secrets buried beneath the concrete or the engines sleeping in the dark. He realized that some miracles do not arrive with thunder or bright light, but in quiet steps, like a loyal dog nudging him toward the truth, or an old key left behind by a father who never stopped loving his son. And perhaps, in a world filled with noise and uncertainty, such miracles are the clearest whispers of God, reminding us that nothing done in love is ever forgotten. Every one of us carries a story like that, something broken, something hidden, something waiting to be healed. We don't always see the purpose behind the hardships we face, but sometimes when the timing is right, God opens a door we never knew was there, and shows us why the journey had to be the way it was. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who could use a reminder that grace still finds us, even in the places we've stopped searching. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you are watching from, so we can pray for you, for your family, and for the road ahead. May God bless you and keep you wherever this story finds you.